With the college football regular season clearly in the rear view, it's time for us to sit back and think about just how weird of a sport college football is by going through the most confusing losses of the 2025 season. But if you want to know what's truly confusing, it's trying to get a nice, nutritious, and healthy meal in a timely manner while being incredibly busy, which is why I'm happy to talk to you about today's sponsor, Factor. Factor delivers fresh, never frozen meals directly to your door. Guys, Factor is a legitimate game changer. The food that they provide to you is not just restaurant quality, it is also delicious. And you never feel bad about eating it because it is dietitian approved and it's just good for you. And what's even better is how many options they have with over 100 rotating weekly meals, all made with incredibly high quality ingredients. Like today, while I was recording this, I was eating garlic pork tenderloin with green beans, and dude, it was legitimately so good. But don't just take my word for it. Go to factor75.com and use code PUNTSFB50. That's factor75.com using code PUNTSFB50 to get 50% off your first order and free breakfast for an entire year. So make a big impact in your life. Get some nutritious food that's healthy for you and fast at factor.com using code PUNTSFB50. Trust me, you're going to love it and you'll thank me later. Starting off with an honorable mention, which is going to be Texas Tech's lone loss to Arizona State. Now, don't get me wrong. I get that they are missing their starting quarterback this game, and Arizona State isn't a horrible team, but you're talking about a team who just got blown out 42-10 by Utah, taking on the number 7 team in the country and putting up the most points that any team had all season on them. Yeah, you heard me right. Texas Tech, known for having one of the most dominant defenses in the country, would play 12 of their 13 games without allowing more than 20 points scored. One of those games being an absolutely dominant win against Utah, who, by the way, just beat the brakes off of Arizona State. And might I remind you that Texas Tech also didn't have their quarterback for the game against Utah. So all in all, the more you think about this game, the more confused it gets, especially as Arizona State went on to immediately lose again to Houston and then got crushed by Arizona at the end of the year. So it wasn't like this was their big turnaround moment, and Texas Tech absolutely locked in as they allowed for less points in their final 4 games combined than they did against Arizona State. We'll move on to number 5, and it's a more of a deep cut. It's when the University of North Texas got absolutely gobsmacked by South Florida. Now, for some context, South Florida was having a pretty up and down year. Like, they opened up by hilariously knocking off number 25 Boise State, then turning around and knocking off a top 25 Florida team, and though neither of those teams would finish in the top 25, they would then get smacked down to reality by Miami, just going on an absolute tear after that though by demolishing South Carolina State, Charlotte, North Texas, and Florida Atlantic. Except one of those games is not like the other. That's right, North Texas is not at all in the realm of an FCS school and 2 bottom feeders. At this point, North Texas was completely undefeated, had crushed Washington State, and were one big break away from being a top 25 team when South Florida shoved their head into a locker. The weird part was not that they lost, but how bad the loss was, with it being a 63-36 palindrome loss. But the fact is that after this, South Florida just never played that well again. Like, they dropped 2 more games to Navy and Memphis, who, don't get me wrong, were both pretty solid teams, but they didn't even beat the bottom feeders as bad as they beat one of the best teams in their conference. And on the flip side, North Texas just kind of took this as a footnote and went right back to beating the brakes off of teams, including Navy, and ended up in the conference championship against Tulane, who, don't worry, is going to be on this list too. But don't get me wrong, it's not the fact that 2 good teams played each other and one of them lost that makes it weird. It's just how bad North Texas played this game and how easily the Bulls capitalized on it in ways they wouldn't do for the rest of the season that really make it stand out as a pretty confusing loss. And speaking of teams getting blown out in ways we would never expect, let's go to number 4 on this list, and that's Illinois getting the absolute brakes beaten off of them by Indiana. At this point, Indiana does not need much introduction. They just won the Big Ten, they have been absolutely dominant all year, and you're not going to find many people higher on the Hoosiers than me. That being said, it still does not make sense how they forced Illinois just to quit in a football game the way that they did, and absolutely ran up the score on the Illini with a 63-10 win. This was their second biggest margin of victory in the entire year, and easily Illinois' biggest loss by a mile. I mean, they had a chance to play Ohio State, and it's not like the Illini came close to winning that game, but shoot, at least they were in the same ballpark as the Buckeyes at the end of the game, and finished their season with a respectable 8-4. All in all, this goes into the category of not weird that they lost, but just confusing by how bad they lost, because a 53-point victory as a top 10 team is something that will definitely make you scratch your head. But when we move on to number 3, we're going back to every SEC fan's least favorite conference right now, the American Conference, as we're going to get a look at one of the more confusing losses this year, which was how the now playoff-bound Tulane Green Wave took on the University of Texas San Antonio and not just lost, but got the absolute hell beat out of them by the Roadrunner. Now, to add some context, Tulane is a good team. They're not as flashy and high-flying as North Texas or South Florida, so you won't see them put up those big scores, but they handle business with the best of them, except for when playing against number 10 Ole Miss and got dominated. But shoot, they even beat a middle-of-the-pack Big Ten team in Northwestern and handed them their worst loss of the entire season in a 23-3 beatdown. And let me add that they beat now ACC Conference champion, the Duke Blue Devils, which is its own fiasco. But their out-of-conference wins were good. They have a quality loss to Ole Miss, and they would beat Army, East Carolina, and Memphis, some of the better teams in their conference, as well as winning the conference championship against North Texas. So this is a solid team, but UTSA, on the other hand, wasn't really in that category. They beat some bottom feeders, but for the most part would lose to teams like Temple and Texas State, and both North Texas and South Florida, the teams I previously talked about, would beat the Roadrunners by over 30 points. But that would not stop them from having a huge 31-point first half to completely run away with the game against the Green Wave, who would try to battle back in the second half, only to have Tulane get their second loss of their season, outscoring Ole Miss against them while beating them this game. So that just does not make any sense in the long run, but in my opinion, it still makes more sense. Then number 2, Syracuse taking on Clemson. We're at game 4 of the college football season, and people kind of thought they knew what was going on. Both Clemson and Syracuse had losses to ranked SEC opponents, with Clemson's loss looking much better than the Orange. Then Clemson would drop a game to Georgia Tech in week 3, while Syracuse would win a cupcake match against UConn and Colgate. Wait, UConn is good this year? Well, I'm going to ignore that, because then they would have to play against each other, and it was a pretty cut and dry matchup in the favor of the Clemson Tigers. But at the end of the game, a solid but not game-breaking performance by Steve and Jelly was enough to pretty handily knock off the Tigers in a 13-point win. Unfortunately, during this, Steve was going to get injured, which I guess could somewhat explain what was about to happen to Syracuse and their offensive production, but Jiminy Christmas, the whole team just seemed to fall off a cliff after they played this. And sure, they played against all the ACC's best opponents like Duke, SMU, Pitt, Georgia Tech, and Miami, but they would also lose to Boston College, who was 2-9 going into that game. And of course, the really bad one was getting 70 points dropped on their head by Notre Dame. And on the flip side, Clemson turned around and beat Chapel Hill, blew the doors off of Boston College, and even upset Louisville. So could how different these two seasons went really be explained by the injury of Steve and Jelly? If so, he's about to be the best quarterback in college football when he comes back next year, because that just shows how important he was for Syracuse. But that leads us to number 1, the most confusing game of the entire year. And if you've been keeping up with college football, you've probably already guessed it. Alabama taking on Florida State University. Now, Florida State was coming into this year the opposite of hyped. They were 2-9 last year and were a disaster, the laughingstock of college football even, after pretty much the entire team opted out of their bowl game a couple years ago to get blown to smithereens by Georgia. And meanwhile, Alabama was definitely on a down year the year prior, but they were still a bubble playoff hopeful team at the end of the season. So coming in, nobody had high hopes for the Seminoles, but I'll be damned. They didn't just win this game, but Castellanos looked awesome. They completely stifled Alabama's ground game and immediately put the nation on high alert for Florida State being a miraculous turn to the grand stage, as well as other beliefs that Alabama had finally fallen off. But boy howdy, you and I could not have been more wrong about both of those assumptions. After Florida State got out of their cupcake games following the Alabama win, they would go on a 4-game slide against Virginia, Miami, Pitt, and Stanford before being able to regroup with a little win over Wake Forest and then dropping 3 of their next 4 games to firmly be a bottom feeder in the ACC after the highest of highs to open the season. Then we got to cut back in on Alabama, and they have been dominant. They knocked knocked off number 3 Georgia, number 16 Vanderbilt, 14 Missouri, and 11 Tennessee in a row, and only dropped one game in a tight 2-point loss to number 11 Oklahoma. And yeah, they lost to UGA pretty bad in the SEC championship, but regardless, they made it to the college football playoff, which is about as far away from where Florida State is as possible, making that loss just even more confusing as the season went on. But those are what I think the most confusing losses of 2025 are. Let me know if there's a weird loss you think I left out, and peace.